Imagine checking into a budget motel room. You notice a strange smell. You light incense, spray air freshener, but nothing works. You complain to management, but they just clean the carpets and change the sheets. You sleep in that room for weeks. You eat breakfast on that bed. Your children play on that floor. And beneath you, hidden inside the bed frame itself, is the body of a woman who's been missing for over a month. This isn't fiction. This happened in Memphis, Tennessee in 2010. And the most disturbing part, police had already visited that room. They were looking for her. They just never looked under the bed. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about Sony Milbrook, a 28-year-old mother of 5 whose disappearance became one of the most shocking police failures in Tennessee history. But this isn't just a story about where she was found. It's about why no one found her sooner, and how the man who put her there walked free for 42 days while guests slept mere inches from her body. Before we continue, please take a second to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow. Sony Milbrook was born on February 15, 1981 in Memphis, Tennessee. She grew up in a large, close-knit family with 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and extended family all around. Her mother, Christine Milbrook Bennett, raised Sony in a household full of love and support. Sony was especially close to her cousin, Pamela. They were more like sisters than cousins, sharing secrets, dreams, and later, trauma that would bind them in ways no family should have to experience. By 1998, Sony was 17 years old, and in the 8th grade. She was magnetic, the kind of girl who turned heads in the hallways. That's when she met him, Leith Moody. He was older, charismatic at first, and he saw something in Sony that he wanted to possess. Their relationship started the way many abusive relationships do, with charm, attention, and promises. But it didn't take long for the mask to slip. By 1999, Sony's mother, Christine, noticed bruises on her daughter's chest. When she asked about them, Sony broke down in tears. She admitted the truth. Moody had done this to her. But despite the bruises, despite the fear in her daughter's eyes, Sony refused to report him. Why? Because Moody had already gotten inside her head. He'd isolated her from friends. He made her believe she couldn't survive without him, and he made her believe that if she told anyone, things would get worse. She had no idea how much worse they were about to get. Later that year, Sony moved into her own apartment in the Fraser section of Memphis. She was trying to create independence, to build a life for herself and the 4 children she now had with Moody, 3 daughters and a son. But independence was an illusion. One day, the apartment management called her. There had been a disturbance at her unit. When Sony rushed home, she found devastation. Her furniture had been slashed. Clothes were torn and thrown across the room. Food was smeared on the walls. The TV was gone. Toiletries were scattered everywhere, even under the stairs outside her door. And on the bathroom mirror, written in red nail polish, was a message: "Kiki loves you." Kiki, that's what Moody called her. It was his nickname for Sony, a term of endearment that had become a signature of terror. On October 31, 2000, Halloween night, Sony, her cousin Pamela, and Moody went to a bar called Mirage. It should have been a fun night out. Instead, it became another nightmare. Without warning, Moody slapped Sony across the face in front of everyone. Then he threw his drink at her. Humiliated and terrified, Sony and Pamela left immediately. In the car, Pamela noticed Sony was shaking uncontrollably, her whole body trembling with fear. Sony begged Pamela to take her home quickly, before Moody could follow them. Back at the apartment, Sony locked herself inside. She put a padlock on the door. She added a chain. She was trying to create a barrier between herself and the man who had become her tormentor. It didn't work. An hour later, Moody arrived. He banged on the door, screaming threats. Pamela tried to reason with him. She even threatened to call the police. Eventually, Moody seemed to calm down. Pamela asked Sony if she'd be okay, and Sony insisted she would be. So Pamela left. That was a mistake. That evening, Pamela received a call that made her blood run cold. Sony was in the hospital. Somehow, Moody had gotten into the apartment. When Sony tried to end the relationship once and for all, he responded with the most brutal assault yet. He tore off her clothes. He beat her head, face, arms, breasts, and between her thighs. Her body was covered in bruises. One of her teeth was loosened, and then he wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled her until she lost consciousness. But he didn't kill her. Not that night. He wasn't done with her yet. For the next 8 years, Sony lived in a cycle of violence that she couldn't break. She tried to build a life. She worked at Christian Academy, where she was known as reliable and punctual. She was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. She had given birth to a 5th child, but Moody was always there, in the shadows of her life, waiting to strike. In 2008, Sony called her boss one morning. She said she couldn't come to work because her face was so badly bruised. She didn't want the students to see her. When she finally returned a few days later, the bruising was still so severe that her director allowed her to wear sunglasses inside the building. In conversations with her supervisors, Sony opened up about what she was enduring. She told them Moody had chased her in his car, trying to force her off the road. She told them she lived in constant fear, but she didn't report him. Not yet. On October 6, 2008, everything came to a head. Sony was supposed to be at work at 5 p.m. She never showed up. Instead, her boss received a text message that made her immediately call 911. Moody is holding me hostage at home. He's been beating me all day. 2 police officers arrived at Sony's apartment. They knocked. No answer. The door was locked from the inside. They called the fire department. When firefighters broke down the door, police saw Moody jump out of a window at the back of the apartment and flee. Inside, they found Sony standing in the hallway, crying, unable to speak. Her 4 children stood nearby, watching. Sony's face and neck were covered in bruises and scratches. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, she told police everything. Moody had refused to let her leave the house. He wouldn't let her or the children near the door or windows. He had grabbed one of their children and hurt him, then prevented Sony from taking him to the hospital. She told them he'd tied a baby blanket around her neck and choked her until she lost consciousness. And before he fled, he'd made a promise. Next time, I'll kill you. Police searched the area, but couldn't find Moody. Sony left with her children in her car that night. 3 days later, on October 9th, Sony went to court and applied for a restraining order. She was afraid for her safety. She wanted legal protection from Moody. But on October 23rd, Sony missed her court date. The protective order was never granted. Why did she miss court? We'll never know for certain. But based on what happened next, it's likely Moody had already convinced her not to go, or threatened her if she did. Nearly 6 months passed. On March 10, 2009, Moody was supposed to take the children to the doctor. Instead, he started another violent argument with Sony. He accused her of having a new boyfriend. The argument escalated quickly. He slapped her. He pulled her hair. Sony managed to break free and ran out of the apartment. Moody was screaming after her, threatening to kill her. Then, in an act of pure cruelty, Moody grabbed their youngest child, an infant, and drove away at high speed. A police patrol, responding to a domestic disturbance call, arrived just as Moody was fleeing. Officers tried to stop him. He escaped. This is important. Remember this moment, because this was one of many times police had the opportunity to stop what was coming. By early 2010, Sony was 28 years old. She was still trying. She was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. She'd just given birth to her 5th child, but the baby's health was so poor that Sony had to stay home to care for the infant. She was exhausted, she was struggling financially, and Moody was still in her life, still controlling her, still terrorizing her. In January 2010, Sony and her children moved into the Budget Lodge in Memphis. It was a last resort, a cheap motel where she hoped to find some breathing room from the chaos of her life. But Moody followed her there. On the very first day at the motel, Sony and Moody's argument became so loud that hotel staff had to intervene. Other guests were complaining about the noise. On January 22nd, hotel security witnessed something alarming. Moody drove at high speed in front of Sony's room, then began shouting up at her as she stood on the 2nd floor balcony with her children. In his rage, he threw a grocery bag at her. When security approached and asked Moody to leave, something strange happened. They asked him for his room key. Moody pulled out keys to 3 different rooms, none of them registered in his name. He'd been staying at the motel secretly, in unregistered rooms, stalking Sony. That evening, Sony and her children moved to room 222. The night manager told Moody to leave the property. He did, but the confrontations continued over the next few days. Security repeatedly warned Moody and told him not to return. On January 26th, Sony called her cousin, Pamela. She told her about the stress she was under. She said she was at the motel and that she needed to tell Pamela something important. Sony promised she'd call back later, either when she left the motel or when Moody left first. That phone call never came. The next morning, January 27th, Sony took her children to daycare and dropped her oldest daughter off at school. That was the last time anyone saw Sony Milbrook alive. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, Sony's oldest daughter waited at school for her mother to pick her up. Sony never came. The school secretary called Christine, Sony's mother, and asked her to come get the child. Christine tried calling Sony. No answer. By 6 p.m., Christine realized Sony's other children were still at daycare. No one had picked them up. Sony wasn't answering her phone. Christine knew something was terribly wrong. At 10:30 p.m., police arrived at the daycare center. They took a missing persons report. Christine told them everything she knew about Moody, about the violence, about the Budget Lodge. On January 29th, just 2 days after Sony disappeared, officers from the Memphis Police Department's Missing Persons Unit went to the Budget Lodge to investigate. They asked staff questions. They looked around the property. But here's where everything goes wrong. They never entered room 222, the room where Sony was last seen, the room where her belongings were still scattered on the floor, the room that still had her children's clothes on the bed. They never went inside. And here's the twist that makes this case so haunting. Sony was already in that room. She'd been dead for days. Her body was hidden inside the bed frame, just feet away from where officers stood in the hallway asking questions. If they had just opened that door, if they had just looked inside, but they didn't. For 42 days, Sony Milbrook's body lay hidden inside the bed frame of room 222. And during those 42 days, something unconscionable happened. The room was cleaned. The room was rented out. Multiple guests stayed there. On January 28th, the day after Sony was reported missing, the housekeeping manager returned to room 222. The room appeared empty. Sony's belongings were cataloged and moved to storage to avoid paying for the unpaid room. The room was cleaned and prepared for new guests. James and Rhonda Sargent moved into room 222 in late January. Almost immediately, they noticed something was wrong. There was a smell, a terrible, foul odor that they couldn't identify. They tried everything: incense, air freshener, opening windows. Nothing worked. They even discovered that previous tenants had tried the same thing. There were scented tissues stuffed in the ceiling tiles and vents. The smell was especially strong when someone sat on one of the beds. They complained to management multiple times. The hotel staff cleaned the carpets, changed the bedding, scrubbed the bathroom, but the smell persisted. Meanwhile, police were investigating Sony's disappearance. On February 2nd, Moody was found sitting inside Sony's car at a shopping mall parking lot. He was arrested for car theft and held for 48 hours. That night, detectives questioned him about Sony's disappearance. Moody's story was calm and calculated. He said the last time he saw Sony was January 26th, around 7 a.m. He claimed they'd had an intimate conversation in the motel room. Then he'd left to get her car keys and drove away. He said Sony was planning to use her student loans to buy a new car, so he didn't see a problem with keeping hers. He claimed he'd been living in Sony's car ever since, even though it had been snowing, and investigators found evidence he'd actually been staying at another hotel. On February 3rd, police found Sony's debit card and recent purchase receipts in her car. They searched the clothing storage at the Budget Lodge, hoping to find DNA evidence. They found nothing useful, and because they couldn't find enough evidence linking Moody to Sony's disappearance, they had to release him. Moody walked free. On February 4th, police visited Moody's uncle's house. They found a DVD player from Sony's motel room. They found Sony's wallet. Moody had given these items to his cousin, claiming he'd borrowed the DVD player to watch a movie on January 24th. That DVD player had a coaxial cable. Remember that detail. By March, the sergeants had complained so many times about the smell that the hotel did a more thorough cleaning. They cleaned the carpets again, replaced the bedding, washed the bathroom curtains, replaced the window blinds. The smell not only persisted, it got stronger. The manager discussed the situation with the hotel's security guard. During the conversation, they suddenly remembered something. The former tenants of room 222, including Sony, had disappeared at the end of January. The security guard told the manager they should check the room one more time. He suggested they look for blood or signs that something serious had happened. About 10 minutes later, they went to room 222 together. The manager removed the mattress from one of the beds. Underneath was the box spring, and underneath that was the bed frame. The bed frame had a partition at the bottom, a wooden barrier designed to prevent people from using the space underneath for storage. But when they removed the box spring and looked through the edges of the bed frame, they saw something that would haunt them forever: a body. In an advanced state of decomposition. They immediately called 911. When police arrived, they documented the scene carefully. The bed frame showed signs of damage. 2 broken pieces of wood near the head of the bed, consistent with a heavy object being forced inside. There was a towel and a cloth bag placed between the body's legs. The body was wearing only a shirt, completely nude from the waist down. The forensic team determined the cause of death: strangulation. Wrapped around the neck was a coaxial cable, the kind used for DVD players. The wire was wrapped around the neck, then around one arm and chest, ending in the back. According to the medical examiner, death would have required at least 2 to 3 minutes of continuous pressure. DNA samples confirmed the body was Sony Milbrook, and on 5 sections of the cable, they found male DNA. The coaxial cable matched the type used for the DVD player Moody had borrowed from his cousin on January 24th, 3 days before Sony disappeared. On March 18, 2010, Leith Keith Moody was arrested and taken to the Mason Detention Center. He was charged with first-degree murder. Police held a press conference and acknowledged that Sony's family deserved answers. They admitted that while they had pursued different avenues of investigation, The discovery of Sony's body in a room that had been cleaned and rented multiple times was unprecedented. They expressed regret that the room had been disturbed so many times, making evidence collection nearly impossible. The public was outraged. Rhonda Sargent, one of the tenants who'd stayed in room 222, spoke to the media. She said if police had just asked to enter the room during their visit in January, they might have discovered Sony in time. On March 24, 2010, Sony's family held a funeral to say goodbye. Her 5 children were placed in the care of her sister and brother-in-law, who fought to obtain legal guardianship. Sony's sister made a promise. She would keep the children together as a family. She would make sure they had everything they needed: food, clothes, stability, and love. But the pain of Sony's loss would never fully heal. Moody's trial began in February 2014, more than 4 years after the crime. By then, the Budget Lodge had been shut down. Moody pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney argued there was no conclusive evidence, no witnesses, no fingerprints on the bed frame matching Moody's prints. The defense even suggested someone else might have killed Sony, claiming she'd been involved with other men. But the prosecution had one piece of devastating evidence. On February 1st, 4 days after Sony disappeared, someone used her prepaid benefits card at a convenience store. Security footage showed a man in a yellow shirt using Sony's card to buy orange juice, withdraw cash, and buy a cigar. That man was Moody. The defense argued his calm demeanor proved his innocence. The prosecution argued it proved he was cold-blooded and calculated. On February 7, 2014, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Moody was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He appealed the verdict, arguing the court had improperly considered evidence of his past violent behavior. On July 7, 2015, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction and affirmed the sentence. Leith Keith Moody remains in prison today. Sony Milbrook was 28 years old when she died. She was a mother of 5. She was a student trying to build a better life. She was a woman who tried repeatedly to escape a violent man, but the system failed her at every turn. Police had multiple opportunities to intervene. If they'd entered room 222 on January 29th, when they first visited the Budget Lodge, Sony's body would have been discovered within 2 days of her death. If the restraining order she'd applied for had been granted, maybe she'd have had legal protection. If Moody had been held in custody after the October 2008 hostage situation, maybe Sony would still be alive. But none of that happened. Sony's story isn't just about one man's violence. It's about how domestic abuse victims are often failed by the very systems designed to protect them. It's about how warning signs are ignored, how complaints aren't taken seriously, and how victims are left vulnerable. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. Sony's children are grown now. They carry their mother's memory and her legacy, and hopefully her story serves as a reminder that we must do better for victims, for families, and for justice. If you want to see another case where police failures led to tragedy, check out my video. Just click the link below. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story so Sony's name is remembered. Leave a comment below telling me what you think about how this case was handled, and what changes you'd like to see in how domestic violence cases are investigated. I'll see you in the next one.